All right. Hello. I hope everybody is healthy. I am Marquez Gibson, and this is my closing argument. On January 13th, 2015, a single gunshot rang out in a Fairview suburb. A gunshot that came from a .357 revolver. A gunshot that ended the life of 11-year-old Sydney Park. The bullet that killed Sydney, the bullet that lodged into her left temple, was fired by Miss Duran. It's not disputed that the bullet was fired by the defendant's daughter, and no one disputes that the shooting took Sydney's life. That leaves only one question for your consideration. Should you conclude this was in fact an intentional action, there is no choice but to declare intentional wrongful death. The question before you is whether Miss Duran intentionally shot Sydney Park. The defense claims the shooting was just an accident, rising out of a game Sydney wanted to play called roulette. But how could this possibly be an accident when every action Miss Duran took was intentional and of her own volition? Through her own testimony, we know that Miss Duran intentionally picked up the gun. Miss Duran intentionally aimed that gun at Sydney's head. Miss Duran intentionally pulled the trigger. All these acts by Miss Duran were done with intent. You will recall that when Miss Duran testified, she stated that she did not believe the gun was loaded. The only other witness, Sydney Park, is dead, shot by Miss Duran. How then do we determine whether to believe Miss Duran's version of events? Allow me to remind you of the key facts. Firstly, recall the testimony of Officer Stanfield, who stated under oath that Miss Duran told him she watched Sydney load the gun, and that it was Miss Duran, not Sydney, that suggested they play roulette. Now, this directly contradicts with what Miss Duran stated under oath. Secondly, recall also that Officer Stanfield stated that the only way to load the gun would be to engage a release mechanism to release the revolver's loading chamber prior to loading the bullet. And during sworn testimony, crime scene technician Jules Sebastian stated that several sets of fingerprints were found on the gun. Sydney Park's on the barrel and Miss Duran's on the loading chamber. Now remember, Officer Stanfield stated the only way to release the loading chamber was by engaging a release mechanism. Therefore, we can reasonably conclude that Miss Duran did just that, and in doing so, she left fingerprints. The only testimony that Miss Duran did not intentionally shoot Sydney Park comes from the shooter herself, a shooter who repeatedly said under oath that she didn't believe the gun was loaded, but who told Officer Stanfield at the scene that she watched Sydney load the gun. A shooter who said she had no idea how to load a gun, but whose prints were the only ones found on the loading chamber of the revolver. A shooter who said under oath that it was Sydney who wanted to play roulette, but who told Officer Stanfield at the scene that it was her that wanted to play roulette. Two contradictions of her own testimony in one key physical piece of evidence disproves what Miss Duran said under oath. These three facts point to one clear conclusion. Miss Duran intentionally shot Sydney Park. On January 13th, 2015, a single gunshot rang out in a Fairview suburb. That gunshot took the life of Sydney Park. That gunshot stripped the Park family of a future. That gunshot was intentionally fired by Miss Duran. Now, you cannot bring back Sydney, but you do. You do have the power to ease the Park family's suffering by denouncing the shooting and declaring intentional wrongful death. Thank you.